What's up, YouTube? So some of you are probably aware that recently I posted a video about the latest Softube plugin, and I wanted to do a bit of an update on that video because I feel like some of the things may have been a little bit misconstrued. I think my tone in the video may have come off a little bit different. I think a lot of you guys assumed that I don't like the plugin, even though I said quite a few times that I really do like the sound of the plugin. There was just a couple of things that I wanted to outline, and I feel like some things I maybe left out, and yeah, I just feel like I didn't do the video as good as I could have. Thanks to some comments, I also realized that the audio in the video was rendered quite lossy. So yeah, it was just a bad look all around. I figured I wanted to do a bit of an update video, redoing a lot of the things that I spoke about in that video. I'm going to include some of the footage from that video as well, but I also just want to look at things from a slightly different angle. I want to thank everyone who commented on the video that gave me a bit of insight into what I may have been displaying wrong. There was a couple of concerns about the fact that an audio interface's inputs are often not DC coupled, which is true, and that can often skew a scope when comparing the raw waveforms from an analog hardware, which is absolutely correct. I think the issue was that there was too many variables in my scientific explanation. However, like I said in the video, I have been a Roland SH101 user for over a decade, and I do know that the waveforms are slightly different. I've read them on analog scopes as well as digital scopes which allow DC inputs. So what I'm going to do is quickly show you on the screen some screenshots of my Roland SH101's slightly skew squared waveform, and a couple of screenshots of a couple of other square waveforms from other synths through the exact same signal path into the scope. No computers, no audio interfaces, and no anti-aliasing filters, no DC blocking circuits or anything touched these. So you can kind of see, like, I do know that the Roland square wave is not square. It is slightly different. So I'm going to talk about why I think that is, but it's present in almost all of the Roland synths that came out in that era. So I also just want to apologize because I think I was a little bit quick to jump to some assumptions in the video about how certain things are done, even though, I don't know. The companies will obviously never tell us exactly how their trade secret stuff are done. So I was very quick to assume things, and the guys at Softube were actually really nice. They reached out to me and I had a pretty long Zoom conversation with them. I think, yeah, like I said, I think maybe my assumptions were a little bit drastic and quick, and I do want to apologize for that, and I do want to kind of make up for it a little bit with why I think there were these certain differences in what I measured and what other developers and manufacturers measure compared to what I think actually happened. But like I said, the slightly skewed waveforms from Roland hardware synths of the era is not caused by the fact that the oscillator itself doesn't generate the clean waveforms. I'm not a technician, I'm not a developer, I'm not a scientist or anything. I'm just a very big synth nerd, and I've kind of been very interested in how these things are created. I've built various, DIY stuff myself, so I do know a little bit about what a DC blocking filter is. When a capacitor and a resistor is wired in a circuit in a particular way, and when the values are a particular thing, it creates a DC blocking circuit, which essentially doesn't allow any frequencies below a certain point, and thus removing any low frequency oscillation from a sound. So here's a picture that I dug up online of some circuit diagrams from a Roland SH101. In quite a few places in the circuit, you can actually see where there's a resistor and a capacitor wired together. Like I said, I'm not a technician, so I'm not very certain about this kind of thing, but what I do know is that the skewed waveforms, again, like I said, aren't created by the actual oscillator itself. It's further down the chain. There's basically like a DC blocking circuit that changes the waveform before the output of the synth. So I started thinking about this, and I started realizing, what's most likely happened? Look, I don't know because Softube hasn't told me. They won't tell anybody, obviously, because it's trade secrets. But what I presume happened is maybe they took the readings Curtis 3340 chip, which produces clean square waves and clean saw waves and, those kinds of things, or has the ability to do so. And then I think they modeled the filter on the chip. They did a really good job on the filter as well. I think In the previous video, I didn't talk enough about what they did right. I kind of just found one thing and I latched onto that and I kind of just focused on that a little bit, which I think isn't the greatest way to do a review video. Anyway, so like I said, after thinking about it a bit and realizing that, what they've probably done, again, I don't know, and I can't actually say, this is purely assumption. Again, I'm assuming, which, anyway. I said in the video that I kind of assumed how accurate their component modeling may have been. And then thinking about it, they most likely did this, where they actually measured the exact readouts of the components themselves rather than the full signal path. And then it made me realize, that is actually, it does actually sound like what we would call component modeling, because they're modeling each of the components as opposed to the entire signal path. But anyway, like I said, I don't know. And I want to make it clear that that's purely an assumption. So I loaded the plugin. First thing I noticed is it looks absolutely fantastic. They've really gone all out with the interface. You can even see there's some parts where like bits have been rubbed off with the paint. There's the reflection of the keys up at the top here. You can even choose one of 3 colors, which the original Roland SH101 was available in. However, the white is a bit puzzling because 101 was never available in white. That being said, that's okay. I think they've just kind of gone a little bit with artistic license here. I think with the interface, that's okay. Use artistic license with the interface as much as you want, maybe to make it more readable, to make it more usable. I have no problem with that. So what I thought is, let me try load up an initialized preset and just listen to what the saw wave sounds like, what the square wave sounds like, and just fiddle with the filters and see how closely it reminds me of my original hardware unit over there, which I've been using almost on a daily basis for the past 10 plus years. One thing that I was a bit puzzled with is the fact that there's no init preset. So literally, you got to go through the browser and find a preset which is as close to init, and then kind of, reduce all of the settings back to default, which is a bit puzzling. For me as a sound designer, the first thing I expect to see in a VST is an init preset, because, otherwise how are we going to design sounds? That being said, like I said, the synth does sound great like as you load it. It's got that classic, analog sound. And the presets sound great. So it's not so much of an issue if you're not, one of those people that design sounds from init. However, that being said, it's just something that's kind of standard to me. I kind of had to initialize the synth myself by turning all of the values back to default and then sliding up the square waves slider over here. So basically, for those who don't understand the routing of the classic SH101, it's basically your oscillator control section is over here. So you've got the ability to pulse wave modulate the squares and that kind of thing. Over here is your mixer. You can kind of think of it as it having 3 separate oscillators. However, you can only control them in unison. So they're always playing the same note and they're always synced and that kind of thing. So you're just using this mixer to kind of change the shape of the sound. That being said, is I generally either just use the square wave or use the saw wave, just because the basic wave shapes of this SH101, in my opinion, just sound so great for various reasons. The square wave in the original SH101 is a little bit brighter than your traditional square wave, and you can usually see that on an oscilloscope by the actual wave shape when you look at it on an oscilloscope. The saw wave has a little bit less of that low-end harmonic, so it's also a little bit brighter than your traditional saw wave. This makes this synth particularly good for bright-sounding bass sounds, brassy sounds, lead sounds that really cut through the mix. And I think that's what was really, really special about the SH101, is there's kind of slightly different wave shapes that did it slightly differently from most of the synths that were available at the time. Obviously, stuff like the 303 also has a slightly unique wave shape. That being said, let me show you my findings with the plugin. So like I said, I kind of had to initialize everything myself, which was a little bit annoying, I won't lie. But you can just then go and save your own initialized preset and then, go from there. Anyway, I turned up the square wave and had a listen. So immediately, straight off the bat, it sounds to me like a normal digital square wave that we could potentially recreate in Serum, Vital, Phase Plant, whatever plugin is available nowadays. It didn't give me that brassy, bright factor that I'm used to with the square wave from the SH101. And also, it's got a little bit of a weird clicky, I'm not sure, you probably won't pick this up on the YouTube algorithm, like, honestly, like, I'll admit that. But that's why stuff like oscilloscopes and that kind of thing is so important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this and I'm going to freeze the oscilloscope and we can zoom in quickly and have a look at what's happening with the very first extent of the square wave. So notice there's that little peak over here. So this is something that, for me, is reminiscent of a digital square wave. Keep this in mind. Remember this image of this little peaked square wave over here. Just remember this, okay? So now what we want to do is let's have a look at what the square wave sounds like directly from an SH101. Two things that are apparent for me in the Roland SH101 original square wave is it doesn't have that huge peak at the beginning. And it also doesn't look anything like a square wave, particularly in the lower frequencies. As you go lower, it starts to look more like a kind of flip-flop opposing saw wave type of thing. In the higher registers, of course, it looks a bit more like a square wave. Let me just capture an image of the higher octave. But then keep in mind that we still have a very obvious, like, downward ramp like that. And this is what creates the brightness in the sound. It's basically almost as if, you could picture it almost as if you took a square wave and mixed in a bit of saw wave on top to just add a bit of brightness. And that's what creates, like I said, the kind of classic sound that we know from a Roland SH101. Obviously, that's got to do with how bright certain sounds are, and that's why it's such a distinct synthesizer. It's so easy to get this vast variety of different tones out of just such a simple thing. It's very simple in terms of its architecture, but as you can see, there's these little things, these little intricacies that make it what it is. Let's have a look at some of the other features and how closely they represent the original. So let's look at the saw wave. It's another classic example, I think, that sets the original SH101 apart from almost everything else on the market. So let's have a look at what the saw wave looks like on the original SH101. So notice how it's got this curve, and it's slightly balanced more to the top of the zero crossing. And I believe that's kind of what gives it a bit more of a bright sound, less balanced in the low harmonics and more balanced to the upper harmonics. Again, like I said, that's what gives it that brighter sound. So here, what we could also notice is less peak at the bottom extent of the waveform and a little bit of a peak at the top extent of the waveform. And that's what gives it a bit more transient than what we're used to. So anyway, let's have a look at the Model 82 saw wave. So I'm going to pull down the square slider and turn up the saw wave. So what we're seeing here is very close to what any digital synth could reproduce as a saw wave. The little peak at the bottom extent as opposed to the top, and certain things like that. Kind of, it's obviously different to the original SH101 just by looking at it. Those who maybe can't tell through the YouTube algorithms and that kind of thing, visually we can tell it's very different. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Vital real quick. Let's have a look at what happens if we draw in a saw wave that looks like the same shape as what we got with the Model 82, which would be an upward ramp like this. Okay, so let's play this and have a look at the oscilloscope. Okay, so let's compare it to what we saw just now from the Model 82. Completely flat saw wave with a bit of a bump at the bottom extent, right? Again, completely different to what we know from the SH101. By just knowing the components that go into creating these things, knowing why it's different to the other synths, being able to create that type of thing in any other synth is really not hard. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the things that they got absolutely bang on. In my opinion, some of my favorite things about the Roland SH101 is how immediately playable it is. And that's because of the sequencer. How it works is you press load, play in a melody, and you press play, and it loops that melody over and over again. You've got rests and legatos and stuff that you can program in. But I think just for these really simple psytrance leads, like ARPs and stuff, to just play in a quick lick and let it loop over and over again, and then you can actually transpose it to keys and stuff. I think the immediacy of that kind of thing, for me, it's one of the reasons why I use the 101 in my kind of performances and jams so much, is because you just throw in some notes, let it loop, and just play with some of the modulation. And it's kind of like it confines you within a certain amount of parameters which you can use. And most of those parameters sound good anyway. You're not really worrying too much about tone shaping and all that kind of stuff. You're just playing the sound. And I think they really captured the essence of the playability of the SH101 with the plugin. Some other plugins and stuff that have more advanced sequencing capabilities, I think, kind of dilute that playability because of that. Anyway, I want to show you how quick it is to get a really cool kind of like ARP or lead sound by just pressing this load button, throwing in like 5 notes, and then letting it play over and over again. Check this out. So then obviously another one of my favorite things is to set the modulation over here to random. And then what happens is every time the sequence clocks, it's going to generate a random value, which you can send to any of these mod parameters over here. You can see here, for example, mod. So then this one becomes the amount of random that gets applied to this frequency. And this is really nice for just creating these kind of like ARPs. Okay, so again, the magic is now we could create a bunch of different variations of this by just playing in a different sequence. Say, for example, now we like this patch, we can just play in a different melody now. And this is really why I think I appreciate the kind of immediacy of the SH101 design so much. Just a bit of simple delay and reverb on that. Chef's kiss. Can literally just play a kick under this, maybe a 3/3 stab every now and then. I could sit and listen to this for hours. Okay, so here I've created the same patch on the SH101, and we're going to do some sound comparisons. So first I'll start off with the exact same sound that we heard a minute ago, with the reverbs and delays and everything. I want to try to keep it as contextual as possible. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to strip down some of those effects, and we can kind of try hone in on what I feel some of the differences are tonally. I'm going to start off with the sound example from the Model 82 over here. Obviously, keep in mind, it's very hard to get the exact same patch because the values are voltage controlled. So you can't just dial in the exact value that you want. You've kind of got to look at the lines. So I've tried to line it up with all the lines on the interface compared to the lines on the unit, like exactly. I've got it really close, but there's some slight audible differences that I can hear. Let me see if you guys can pick them up. Okay, so now we're going to jump to the SH101. Okay, so now let's jump to the Model 82, but I'm going to turn off the effects. So firstly, the filter to me sounds bang on. There's a little bit of resonant character in the analog, which kind of howls a little bit differently. It kind of has more of a, I hate to use this term, it kind of sounds a little bit more musical when it hits those weird notes. It kind of creates these atonal characteristics, whereas I feel like that element of the resonance in the software is a little bit toned down. I will accentuate the resonance to full a little bit later so we can really hear that characteristic. But I think the filter tonally is perfect. It sounds so close to me. The random, however, it feels like the analog random has more of a wider range as to what it can, the next number that it jumps to. Whereas it feels like the random in the software has these kind of like sequences which it locks to, almost like a Turing machine as opposed to a proper random. So it kind of like feels like it locks to these little rhythmic things and repeats. And it feels like it's a little bit more balanced in the higher register. Whereas it feels like the analog random has a bit more of a wider range. Just listen to the modulation. I'm going to play both again. And it feels like the SH101 kind of has these weird rhythmic things that it kind of jumps like all the way around. Whereas it feels like the Model 82's random is a bit more programmed. Obviously it's random, so it can't be. But it just feels like it locks into these like little grooves. It also feels like the transient of the Analog 101 just clicks through and cuts nicely. And personally, I believe it's due to the fact that the waveform is slightly different. So the phase offset is not exactly on the zero crossing or when the note starts, compared to the perfect square coming out of the Model 82, where the transient is on the note start point, which often kind of gets cut by envelopes and that kind of thing. So you don't hear that click as the waveform goes up. Whereas with the analog, I think it's a little bit late, so you do hear that click. Let me show you the example of what I'm talking about with the randoms again. Notice how it goes like da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da, and it kind of hits those high notes in succession quite often. Are you guys picking that up? Okay, let's jump over to the SH101. It's strange because both are just randomly generating values, but it feels like the SH101's random value generator just feels a bit groovier. It kind of does these like kind of things, whereas it feels like the random in the software kind of it kind of repeats things a bit too much. That kind of takes the groove away. I guess if you're not using random as much as myself, like it's one of the biggest parts of my sound design and music is random generating of specifically filter modulations and stuff, because you can create such a simple loop and just have it going on forever, and those slight differences will create this kind of like almost sound that sounds like it's never looping twice. But I feel like this doesn't quite capture that. The random in this doesn't quite capture that as much as I would like it to. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is let's compare the exact same patch, but with the square waves. When we switch to the square wave, we start noticing the resonant character start to differ quite a bit. The analog, you can kind of hear it's almost got, I don't want to say a vocal texture because it's not, but it kind of sounds like this kind of, almost like a mouth harp kind of tone with the square wave and the resonance. So what I'm going to do is just to make it a little bit more contextual, let's put the effects back on and we can compare A and B with the effects. This is the Model 82, and then I'm going to jump to the SH101. Okay, so now this is the SH101. I've turned the resonance up by another 2 clicks. For me, the SH101 really starts to come, much like the 303, starts to come alive when that resonance is like closer to the top, because it creates these weird space drum kind of sounds that are just so like spacey and so perfect for like psychedelic rhythmic stuff. So anyway, let's push this up to, it was about just above 8 clicks now. Let's see how this sounds. And now this is resonance on max. So for me, it's perfect. It's perfect until it kind of gets to that 80%, 100% resonance point. Then you can kind of start to pinpoint. It sounds like this is a little bit harsher. The software is a little bit harsher in that kind of 3 to 6K region, specifically when the resonance is like on full, which, I mean, it's standard behavior most of the time, but I feel like it has this kind of lush character. And specifically when that resonance is maximum, this rhythmic element kind of comes out of it. I'm starting to talk in a lot of adjectives and stuff, but and I generally try stick to the more quantifiable sound terms. But that being said, is hopefully these sound demos can kind of outline for me what I'm hearing in the differences. So I'm going to turn the effects off now, just for a clearer picture, and let's start with the Model 82. How's that low end? Yoo! Very nice. So now I want to show you some of my favorite tricks with the 101 style synths. So you're probably wondering why the sub oscillator sounds so strange compared to like every other sub that you're used to hearing. And this is something interesting about the 101 in that the sub oscillator is not a sine wave, it's actually another square wave that's tuned down an octave compared to the original. Or it depends, like you can go 1, 2, -2 with a weird kind of shape there. Anyway, you're probably wondering, how do you get a sine wave out of this to get that really kind of deep tone? Let me actually just show you an example of what this... So yeah, sub-oscillator sounds pretty weak for subs, but there's a really cool way of being able to create a nice sine tone with an analog synth. And this is another thing that I think that they've nailed quite well, is if you just turn down all of the oscillators, you can turn up the resonance of the filter and just use the kind of like resonant nature of a filter to create a sine wave. So often with digital synths, when you turn down all the oscillators or when you turn them off and you kind of just want to tune the filter, it doesn't play because it kind of needs this audio path. So this is kind of cool. Like one thing I think that they've sort of thought about and incorporated that's kind of close to what analog hardware would replicate is you can actually just have no oscillators playing and then just create an oscillator with the filter, which I think is a really interesting technique. So now what we want to do is we want to set the VCA to both gate and gate. So now what happens is it's not going to run this envelope on the actual amplitude envelope. It's just going to use this for the modulations. So then what we can do here is we can use this envelope to kind of create a kick sound. So firstly, let's tune this filter to a tone. And something interesting is you can actually keyboard track the filter. So if we set the resonance up and then put this frequency to a C, then the keyboard track should be relevant. So we can get like tuned 808 style sounds and everything. So let's just put a tuner on here. And then I'm going to play this and we can tune it to a C. So now we've created a nice sine wave, and what we can do now is either use this for like a melody. Let's just put that effect back on here. So we could use this as a nice sine wave melody. I always like creating melodies out of the sine wave characteristics of filters. I personally just feel like it has this different characteristic. It's not quite a sine wave. It kind of feels a little bit more resonant than a traditional sine wave. We could do that, or we could use some of this envelope modulation to either create a kick, or we could just use it to create a bit of transient on the beginning of that melody sound. Cool, so now what we could also do is we could make like a kick drum out of this, like I said. So we could turn it down a couple of octaves and then accentuate the envelope that's controlling the modulation here. Maybe let's go down an octave. So the problem, obviously, because it's an analog thing, there's no phase re-trigger, so we're going to have to just go in and choose one which we think sounds the most accurate. They sound pretty good, all of them actually. But we'll also have to give it a bit of fade out. Maybe we need a bit longer tail. Okay, let's make a bass. Should we make a bass? It's actually relatively simple with the 101, except we've got to take into account again the whole resampling thing. I've just realized that this might be in a different key, the melody, to what we're about to put in with the bass. We're about to put in an F, and I think I rendered this out in C, so we can actually tune it up by 5. So what I want to do is just render out a portion of these single notes, and then we're going to choose the one which has the nicest kind of phase, just slightly offset from the start of the note, and we're going to use that to re-trigger in a sample. Okay, lastly, let's make a psychedelic sample and hold type of lead. So let's turn this down, turn this up, let's turn these up. Okay, last thing, let's make a percussive sound. So let's say those down, no oscillators, let's just turn up the noise. Yeah, so let's do that. So it's a bit of a spacey sound, then we can just trigger it like a lot, and then it'll randomize the modulation each time on the 16th. But then we can also just like mute some of these notes randomly. And then lastly, we can just make like a kind of snare hi-hat type of sound by just resetting some of these modulations on the filter, having just a sound like this. So I guess the conclusion is it sounds so similar and it's still got that playability and it kind of does have that same tone and vibe. There are obviously those little intricacies that are different, but again, like, you know, something that I think is evident is that like no two analog models are the same. That's something that did come up a few times in the comments of the video, and I did post it, is that people were saying, oh, my one sounds different to some of the other hardware ones that they've heard online. So yeah, I think there are these differences which we can account for, but I think that Softube has still done a really good job of, you know, getting everything else, and I think the important parts bang on. I think I didn't talk enough about that in the original video, stuff like how cool the filter sounds, how playable the synth is, you know, how it took me kind of 20 minutes to get almost a full track out, you know. So if you just know how the thing works, especially with these simple things, you just know how the architecture of a plugin works. These simple ones can really, really be powerful at just getting your bread and butter sounds out. But yes, I still stand by my findings in that the square wave is a bit different, the saw wave is a bit different. That being said, I think they've nailed it in terms of how it would sound coming directly out of the oscillator chip as opposed to the full signal path. I think that's something that I had neglected to think about in the original video. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. Hopefully this video is a more in-depth and objective look, and you guys can then make the decision as to what you think are the important parts. You know, do you care that the square wave is that slightly different? You know, most people don't. So yeah, I think I was right when I said that it did sound different to mine unit, because it does, you know, and I'm sure you guys can hear that in the demos. But I still think that Softube has done a fantastic job. You know, I really like the plugin. I really like the sound. I just don't think it's exactly the same. Hopefully I've outlined most of my thoughts and you guys can kind of get the idea. Anyway, awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to my channel and hitting that like button if you like the video. And also, again, thanks to everyone who commented on the previous video and giving me kind of more objective opinions to kind of like approach and do some research. And I think myself, I've learned a lot from this. I've learned a lot from this experience. So anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.